Hey, Austin, I can hear you now. I can see your screen now.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Yeah. It's a little bit of noise right now. I'm going to talk and see how he wants to do this.
Sure.
I'll be back in a minute. Thanks.
All right, no problem.
Hey, Austin.
Hey.
Can you try to speak and we can test if we can hear you?
Yeah. Hello.
Uh,
Testing.
Sorry, wait for a second.
Anything?
Yeah, wait for a second.
Sure.
The speakers are just
No, I got it. Yeah.
You've been incredibly patient and kind to see you, Austin, over. So, Austin, what we're going to do is, first of all, let's see if we can hear you.
Hello?
Please say something. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Can the room hear? I can hear you, but I don't know if the room can hear you. So, just keep going.
Yeah.
Please, Austin, say something. So, I just want to see if
Yeah.
the room.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Can you guys hear Austin back there?
Can anyone hear?
Can you guys hear Austin?
Hello.
No? Okay, well, we're gonna try our best. So the problem, I think the issue, Austin, is that the slides project,
Yeah.
but your sound has to go through the mic. So
Right.
where's the speaker on this thing? This is the speaker.
It's still off speed.
This is the speaker. Okay, so
I see.
we're just gonna put the mic really close to the speaker and see if that works.
Right.
Something like this. Okay, I
Old
think
school.
we've got a decent configuration. All right, folks. I would suggest grabbing some food so we can get started again. We've got Austin Pollok from USC all the way out west. Thanks, everyone. And again, I'm sorry for the people online who can't join us for the food and drinks, but it's a lovely atmosphere here. We haven't had this in so long. I'm just so thrilled to see people, just having a good time, a normal time, like the old days. Please grab some more food, and we want to get started with Austin. As I mentioned, the challenge has been that first it was the projector, and now it's actually the mic. So it looks like, and again, much respect to this amazing setting, the Francis Tavern. Huge deference to this very historical room that we're fortunate to use. So we've got his presentation up. We're going to maximize that in a second. Austin, I'm just going to place the mic here. Hopefully people can hear you. I don't really have a good solution for that. If
No
they don't.
problem.
But I'm sure you're dying to get started. You've only been waiting a little while. So. Okay. So without further ado, guys, please get your food and get some more drinks. And I hope you've got a drink in hand, Austin, because we want you to make sense, but just enough sense.
Yeah, not too much.
Our capacity is somewhat diminished too. So we've got Austin online, who's at the USC. He's going to talk about the Kelly criteria, and I want to thank our speaker coming up next time, Professor, the great, the inimitable Professor Peter Carr. The last time we had Peter here, it was an amazing, unbelievable event. We had, I think, like 109 people packed in this room. Management, so that was our best event to date. I hope we'll have a good turnout for Peter next time. I'm not sure if he's still logged in, but thanks to Peter, we met Austin. I think he's got a fantastic presentation. So let's learn something about the Kelly criteria, and I'm going to hand this off to you on how he'll take care of the rest.
All right, good to go?
Yeah, good to go.
All right. So, hi, everyone. I just want to thank all the organizers for putting on this event and Malin for the invitation. So, I'll be discussing the Kelly criterion for optimal bet sizing for some gambler who has an edge. And if this gambler wants to place a large number of bets in order to best exploit their edge. The main point of this investigation is to derive a formula for the long-term growth rate for a Kelly-type gambler. And when the underlying thing that you're gambling on has heavy tails. So I was first introduced to this topic by Steve Schulles, the quantitative researcher at PIMCO when I was an undergrad at UCI. And this work is based off of joint work with Sergei Latotsky of USC. It's the first part of my PhD thesis, and it was published earlier this year in the SciAm Journal of Financial Mathematics. Okay, so let me start. So the background for this simple setting is consider an experiment with a biased coin flip. So if you happen to stumble across the good fortune of finding a casino giving 1-to-1 odds on a coin flipping game, where you somehow know that the probability of heads is 60%, you might want to partake in this venture. And you ask, should you bet? If so, how should you bet? Does this game have an edge? And then how can we best exploit this edge? So this simple experiment was conducted by Victor Hagani, a former principal of Longterm Capital Management, on a number of quant finance students and professionals to investigate those who are qualified to manage risk and see if they could practically understand simple risk taking in this Very simple setting. Okay. So this concept leads to something called a long-term growth rate function. And it turns out that the optimal exposure that you should be betting every time in this one-to-one payoff gamble where you have 60% heads, 60% chance of getting heads, should be 20% of your wealth every time to compound at an optimal rate of 2%. And it turns out over the course of that Hagani study that very few people were using this optimal exposure. Many people were either severely underbetting and doing well, but not nearly as well as they could have done, or people were taking risks that were far too large and ended up going bust with enough bets. So it's kind of telling us is that if we bet a little more than 40%, this is detrimental in the long run, and you're guaranteed to go bankrupt. Okay. So this is the kind of background motivation for extending this further into gambles that might not be one-to-one payoffs and where the probabilities of seeing these different payoffs can be very extreme. Okay. So this contradicts the natural relation that maybe more risk implies more return, and we see that too much risk implies, at best lower returns and at worst ruin if you go over this 20% exposure. Okay, so the outline will just be a general history of the Kelly criterion, mathematics of the Kelly criterion, and then some proposed future work. So 3 names that pop up when you Google Kelly criterion will be Kelly, Shannon, that's Claude Shannon, and Ed Thorpe. So we'll kind of go into those. And so in 1956, John Kelly was at Bell Labs, and he was investigating Claude Shannon's recently developed theory of communication in a gambling context, where he wrote the kind of now famous paper dubbed the Kelly criterion. So Kelly considered how a gambler with an edge should size their bets so that in the long run, their wealth would be maximized. Well, this gained some popularity amongst, of course, gamblers, and rightfully so in the 60s, the mathematician Ed Thorpe, while on a postdoc at MIT, he developed a card counting system, and he was the original guy who wrote the Beat the Dealer book, if you're familiar. And he used Kelly's solution to determine the optimal bet sizing, given you know the count and you have an edge. So this is a picture of the Kelly paper, a new interpretation of information rate. And this is a picture of Ed Thorpe with his various books. This one here, being called Beat the Market, is perhaps the most prevalent for finance, and he uses he kind of heuristically uses discrete hedging before Black-Scholes published their paper. So I guess maybe just to comment on this, there's also a long history with Thorpe and the Kelly criterion, as well as both practical and academic finance, and there was a lot of beef between, apparently, also in papers, but also outside of academic journals, between Ed Thorpe and the Nobel laureate Paul Samuelson. Samuelson kind of repeatedly said anyone who used the Kelly criterion is a fool. They're taking crazy amounts of risk, et cetera, et cetera. And I believe Peter Carr and Umberto Cherubini have a paper that seek to reconcile this, how to think about the Kelly in a different context that might reconcile their issue. And of course, if you don't know, Ed Thorpe kind of went on to start the first quantitative hedge funds and kind of really was the founder of why I guess all of us are here to some degree. So, all right. And he actually later became a professor at UCI as well. So somewhat local to me. So the motivating questions for this research is, if you were gambling in a real world where extreme events happen, so that is a heavy-tailed world, much like the COVID world, how should we bet so as to maximize our wealth in the long run? More precisely, can we develop a Kelly criterion under fat-tailed models? So the approach that we'll be using here is we first have to model the log gross returns of a gamble, define what we mean by that. We then have to formulate and formalize the wealth dynamics for a compounding gambler, and then establish the long-run growth rate, and finally seek to optimize this long-term growth rate. So in discrete time, the Kelly criterion models the wealth by moving geometrically. So if you consider a wealth process, which we denote by W, N is for the discrete time, and F is for the constant proportional exposure, which we can think of as a fraction in 0, 1. So there will be no shorting and no leverage in this simple model, but you can extend it to allow for that. R is a sequence of IID random returns. So the returns are bounded below by -1. And the wealth process today is equal to yesterday's wealth process plus how much you decide to bet times the outcome of that return. So equivalently, you can back this out and see that the wealth for any investor using exposure, constant exposure F at time N is just initial wealth times the product of the returns with the corresponding exposure F. So for simplicity, we can assume that the returns are independent and identically distributed. So one of the things that Kelly did is he said, well, let me consider this wealth process. And if you do an exponential logarithmic transformation, you can take these compounded returns and make them additive. Once they're additive, you can apply law of large numbers. So, just taking E log of the wealth formula in the previous slide gives you this exponential formula. You take a limit as the number of bets gets larger and larger, and you see this turns out to be the exponential of some infinity times the expected value of log of 1 plus F, your exposure, times the return. And so this is what Kelly decided that we should maximize. Anyone who's compounding their returns, they have some sort of edge, should be maximizing your expected log scaled returns. Okay, so we'll denote this by G sub R of F, and it's the long-term growth rate, right? So this is like your compounding growth rate. And we define having an edge, meaning a positive expected rate of return. Okay. And it turns out also that having this edge will guarantee that your growth rate will be positive for some positive exposure. So this is a well-formulated problem. Okay, so extending this a little further to something we call a Bernoulli Bet, which means simply a two-outcome event that you want to bet on. So this is a motivating example. So if you consider a binary bet with odds B to A, in the first example it was 1-to-1. So B is the thing you're betting on with probability P, and then if that's what you win if you're correct, and you'll lose a amount if you're wrong, and that has a probability of 1 minus P. So in this case, you can compute everything nicely, and you get a formula for your long-term growth rate, and you can actually calculate pretty simply the optimal exposure, F star, the fraction that maximizes your long-term growth rate. Okay, and if, let's say, A and B were, again, 1-to-1, or let's just even say if A was 1, this will lead to the so-called edge over odds formula, which was popularized in a book, which I'm forgetting the name right now, but there was a pop science Kelly Criterion book written some years ago that kind of popularized this formula, edge over odds, kind of the secret money-making strategy. And then, of course, you can also plug this optimal exposure in and see at what rate you would expect your gamble to grow at in the long run. All right, so we can take this a step further and consider a so-called random walk model. So if you consider an investor or gambler or trader, they're kind of used synonymously here, who identifies more short-term edges and then frequently trades or rebalances their portfolio with the single goal of maximizing long-term wealth. So that's kind of the setting that we want here. We have to assume that we're compounding a large enough number of bets over some fixed horizon. And we can also assume that we have a sequence of returns that are modeled as a scaled random walk with some drift. Okay, and we also think that drift is positive. That gives us our edge. Okay, so yeah, positive edge. In this case, we can rewrite the wealth dynamics, which again are the multiplicative process. And it corresponds to compounding n many bets per unit time with a particular exposure at some point in this fixed horizon. Then we can define this other process, WFT, which is some exponential process. And we'll see that, in fact, our discrete time wealth process, compounding over small, short periods, will actually converge to this continuous time wealth process, which we can interpret as the high frequency wealth process, corresponding to continuous rebalancing with a constant exposure, F. Okay, so this is what, the simpler model that we'll use as our prop. Someone who's trading at a high rate, a high frequency. So we use the continuous time to approximate the reality of the discrete time. And then we prove a theorem saying that this in fact converges in law to the process that we think it will, and we do that under general conditions. And then we define that the so now we have our wealth process, our continuous time wealth process, and now we have to define what is our long-term continuous time growth rate, the thing that we want to maximize. So we define this as the time average, the log time average. So you take the log of your wealth process at time t, divide by t, and you take a limit, and that'll define our long-term growth rate. And in this case of the simple random walk, there's a nice formula for the long-term growth rate, which we see is maximized at a simple fraction, mu over sigma squared, sort of your edge divided by, or the mean, your expected rate of return divided by the volatility. And your growth rate will grow, your long-term growth rate will grow optimally at 1/2 of that optimal exposure. All right, so we can then consider a case where we don't know how many bets we're going to compound or how many times we're going to rebalance over a given period. We have some idea, but we're not exactly sure. So in this case, a natural model of the corresponding wealth process is, instead of your time nt, which corresponds to the number of bets that you'll place inside a little time interval of 0 to t, we consider replacing this with a subordinator, so sort of a time change, which represents the randomness of your compounding, number of times you're compounding. Okay, and mathematically, this is a non-decreasing Levy process, independent of the returns. So in a particular example, we consider this subordinator to be a temporally scaled alpha stable process, which is kind of a common heavy-tailed process. And the alpha in this alpha stable process corresponds to the kind of how thick the tails are. So how extreme events can occur under this assumed distribution. Okay. We further have to assume that the scale and skewness parameters equal to 1. You can kind of think of a alpha stable process as a generalized normal distribution that allows for skewness, allows for heavy-tailedness. Yeah. Okay. And there are theorems that justify that thinking. So these alpha stable processes have a nice little property saying that if you scale time, that is the same thing as scaling space according to the 1 over the exponent, 1 over how thick the tail is. All right. So our subordinator actually is just reduces to your number of times you're compounding times a random fluctuation. Okay. So we use a previously established theorem in another paper, and we see our long-term growth rate. And to get an appropriate non-trivial growth rate, we have to scale not just by t, but t to the 1 over alpha this time. So this is our kind of long-term growth rate, which only differs by the ordinary case by this random instance S1 of the random realization of the alpha stable process. So it says our long-term growth rate is actually random, which makes sense because we're compounding at a random number of times, an unknown number of times. We're not sure when we're going to stop compounding. However, the nice part of this is this random function is still maximized at a deterministic fraction. And that deterministic fraction is the same fraction used in the simple random walk model, mu over sigma squared. Okay, so there's some robustness to that result. Now we go to the heavy-tailed model case. So with the results of the previous section in mind, we consider the high-frequency returns from some price process, where we assume that the price process is evolving according to a geometric Levy process. Okay, and we define the returns compounding at a frequency n at time k as just the rate of return of that price process. Okay. So there's a nice theorem for Levy processes. It's called the Levy-Ito decomposition. And it says that any Levy process, which is again used to model heavy tails, can be decomposed into a drift component, a diffusion or a small jump component, and a large jump component. So you can think of this kind of financially as your edge, that's your drift. Your diffusion is any kind of small Gaussian type risks. And the large jump component, it will be any jump risk, any kind of shock risk. Okay. Again, we have the same wealth process. And it turns out that the wealth process is slightly changed, and it has an additional term here which accounts for the jumps. And this mu r is a kind of a jump measure which tells us how many, kind of counts the number of jumps in a particular space over a particular time. Okay. We then establish kind of the main result of this paper, showing that our discrete time process actually converges weakly on, the Score-Hod topology to this continuous time process. So we now have our wealth dynamics for in the case of jumps. Okay. And then now that we have these high frequency dynamics of the wealth process, we have to consider what's our long-term growth rate for the person who's gambling at a high frequency where the thing that they're gambling on has the risk of large fluctuations or jumps. What should their exposure kind of be, or I guess more particularly, what should they be wanting to maximize? What is their objective function they should be optimizing for? Okay. So we establish in another theorem that under appropriate conditions, your growth rate is actually a kind of a function that's decomposed into, it can be kind of broken into the drift, a jump component, and a diffusion component. So it's this more complicated function that depends on these properties of the thing that you're gambling on, and also depends on your exposure. So it turns out this is the formula that you want to optimize for. Okay, so it turns out in the presence of jumps, that you get this extra term, these two extra terms here, where capital F to the R is the compensator process of a Levy process. It's kind of the expected number of jumps over a time period. So it turns out that we can extend this Kelly framework to heavy-tailed models. Okay. And of course, this is something that you can then optimize for and do some simulations on if you think you know the dynamics of your process that you're betting on, the price dynamics. You can simulate and then compute the optimal F. And that kind of remains in future work that I'm doing with my co-author. So some other future research directions that we think could be extending the Kelly criterion to include many simultaneous bets. So we can think of this in a, in a portfolio process. Also including drawdown constraints to avoid effective ruin, because in the process of jumps, I mean, one issue with the Kelly is it already allows for a lot of drawdowns. And so if you're betting on something that jumps a lot, you can get even larger drawdowns. So how to incorporate those into the model. And it just so happens that, oftentimes the long run can be too long. So it would be useful to obtain some estimates of how large N and T has to be to get close to the optimal growth rate. Because again, this is a continuous time approximation for a high frequency bettor, high frequency trader, etc. We can incorporate some transaction costs into the model. And finally, one that I think is pretty interesting and of course also very much in fashion right now is can reinforcement learning rediscover Kelly? So you can consider a neural network approach to finding the optimal exposure, and you can compare with how the optimal exposure is. So, if you frame this problem in terms of a stochastic control problem, which was done originally by Bellman, who created dynamic programming and kind of discrete and as a method to solve control problems. And he did that in the 50s. You can reformulate Kelly as a control problem. And then there's a lot of work being done right now on how to use machine learning techniques, and in particular reinforcement learning, to numerically solve these control problems. So another approach would be to use some kind of high frequency data and use as our loss function the formula that we have established for the long-term growth rate. Try and train the model and see how that does, sort of if it comes close to what our model is saying about what the optimal exposure should be. So that's something that's, definitely very interesting. And I believe that's all I have for now. And so thank you. Any questions?
Hey, Austin? Austin? Okay, you hear us now? Did you hear Leon's question at all, or
No, I didn't hear any. I didn't hear any
we were
questions.
muted? That's hilarious. Okay.
It was silent on my end.
Very salacious details.
If you go back, Austin, to when you first talked about this model in the case of this process, what you
Yeah.
are maximizing is you want to find the F so that the expression, the expected value of T log of W T over W zero, right?
Right.
Limit. Right? I question, think in terms of option theory. What do you ask the more naive question? What about you're rebalancing continuously, re-betting at F for every DT?
Yeah.
And all you want to maximize was the expected value of WT for some fixed capital T, like an option pricing problem.
Right.
Then it's to the same F.
Will that come to the same math? No. So I it will lead to a different formula here, I believe, if I'm understanding. So you're saying take away log, basically. If I was just considering, is that right? The long run of that,
Well,
like the arithmetic average.
Return is like 1 over T expected value of WT over W0 as T goes to infinity, right?
Right.
And F that maximizes that expectation,
Mm-hmm.
right? But instead
Yeah.
of,
So
instead of what about we maximizing the expected value of W for some fixed capital T like an option pricing problem, and you rebalance
Right.
every you
Yeah.
at a factor of F every instant.
Mhm.
No, what F gives you the biggest expected value at some fixed expiration time like an option pricing problem. See what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah, I believe. Yeah. So that would lead to a different formula here. It turns out that for Levy processes, there's also a law of large numbers. So if you just remove the logarithm here and kind of took this will converge to the expected value of WF at say time 1, and then you could compute that. You basically have to compute the expected value of this guy here at time 1. And yeah, so that would, in principle, lead to a different F, at least theoretically. If that's what you were saying, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Austin. So that was a great presentation.
That was too mathematical.
But let me try to step back because
Yeah, I'm not a smart man, but and I'd give you the full medal just for putting this stuff together. It's awesome. But I have a question for you. Why not just double your bet every time you lose and take Martingale instead of all this fancy math?
Sorry, I wasn't able to hear. Something about martingale.
why don't you double down every time you lose? And I mean, I think that's the gambler's ruin problem, right? And
Yeah.
instead of all this fancy math, why can't you just double down? It's actually a very good question, but I think it's got a well-known answer.
Yeah, because it's trying to prevent long-term ruin, which that would, I believe, inevitably lead to. Right.
Well, exactly. So that's only with budget constraints. So this.
In the earliest part of the cycle, I don't remember.
So go back. I mean, like, what is? I mean, he's actually now getting to something very important. But let me come back to in a second because he's actually hinting at the gambler's ruin paradox and the budget constraint and stuff that I used to joke about in my time at Deutsche Bank when the policy was you just double down because they hadn't put a cap on it. It was Deutsche Bank. All jokes aside, I mean, Austin, I think most of us here probably, with the exception of Leon, are not as current on to control. So I think if you can motivate the talk a little better, people have a little more intuition. Now, just to bring it to current day, Rudy Demented Giuliani, those of you who remember where this comes from, right, Ed Thorpe. I mean, sorry, this is not supposed to be political at all. It's just.
Oh yeah, the Ed Thorpe and Giuliani kind of ruining the original hedge fund.
That's right, the original.
Quant hedge fund, the original quant fund.
Princeton Newport Partners.
Yeah, that's
Princeton,
right.
Of course, and I remember meeting with him at a conference a few years back, and the guy who went after him with Frico and busted Ed Thorpe like as though he was actually a bad guy.
Yeah, they shut down the entire Princeton office and RICO'd him.
Yeah, so I mean, it turns out, actually, who the person he was going after was somebody who had a Drexel angle. And
Yeah.
Interestingly, the old Drexel office is right here.
High yield bonds.
Which is also our Carnegie Mellon Cornell campus happens to be there. We have many students from there. So long story short, I'm just trying to back up a bit, abstract away from all this, get back to the mission. So remind us why we're doing this.
Basically, we're
doing
this because
we lost a lot of people with Levy Processes and so before you get 2 minutes in the math, we've still got some time. People have drinks. They should order more. What's the growth rate? And like what
the end goals.
He was hinting at, I think, is really the key part. If you don't have a budget constraint, you can always double down. That's the simple arrangement. With expectation one, you're always going to win, right?
Right. So the main motivation is to figure out how to grow your wealth if you repeatedly compound so interestingly enough, if you continually bet, like in this simple example of the where is it in the in the 1-to-1 betting example, where you're betting 60%, or you have a chance of winning 60% of the time, and the payoff is 1-to-1. If you continually bet a fraction of one, over time, and you can do this simulation, that's what the Victor Hagani study did, you'll go bankrupt, right? So if you just keep, clicking bet my full wealth every time, your wealth will actually go to zero. And that's kind of captured by this long-term growth rate being negative, right? So you're kind of exponentially going to zero. And, so the idea is you can overbet, even in the face of having an edge. Overbetting can be actually detrimental.
This is when you do have an edge, or it's 50-50?
Yeah, no, this is you have an edge. A 60% chance of heads. 60% chance of getting a +1 payoff and 40% of a -1. Yeah. So this might break the intuition that maybe if you keep doubling down, like you still will go to zero, even in the face of an edge. And again, there's simulations. This is something you could easily kind of code and simulate and see that, and that's exactly what happened in that Hagani study, where he gave people about an hour, I believe, and you guys might have been familiar. I think he also did some of it at Cornell or Columbia in the Masters of Finance, one of the courses there, to students and some professors. And, said, he actually told them, okay, keep betting for an hour. You have to keep betting, and we'll pay you up to some fraction of whatever you win. We're not going to pay you if you take the bank and the Kelly strategy, then we're not going to pay you everything, but we'll pay you something. And it turns out, like I said, most people they either overbet or severely underbet. They're very cautious. Some bet 5%, and they had some steady winnings. And they were kind of doing this at a higher frequency, like clicking every second or so. And others, who were betting 80, 90%, 100%, like you could, because when you're compounding and using your reinvested wealth, you go bankrupt, even if you repeatedly double down.
Yeah.
So I think that.
Well, just a little side note, by the way, I was trying to get Victor as a speaker. I couldn't get him, so I tried Nick Lee. And Nick Leeson wanted a huge speaking fee. So we have you. I'm kidding. But okay, so all right, so 20. So this F star 20% is how much you're supposed to be betting?
Yeah, and that'll kind of grow significantly. And so even if you bet more, like 40%, you'll still go pretty much almost every time go bankrupt. Even betting only 40%, given you have the edge. So that's
Right.
kind of the and many people didn't get that, right? They were either very conservative because they just wanted to win something in this little experiment, or others just said, screw it, I'm gonna do whatever and just bet. And they told them all the parameters of the game, and you have the heads is more likely to come up, etc. So kind of keep betting on this coin toss, and so it's kind of like the Kelly criterion. You can also think of it sort of as like a time diversification, right? You might be able to think of in the Markowitz portfolio optimization, which is frequently used as kind of a cross-sectional diversification. You want to spread out your risk for any one period bet, so that if something happens, you don't go bust. However, you don't lose at all. But what happens when you do this repeatedly? And it turns out, things can change. And when you're doing this repeatedly, it turns out kind of there's some evidence that, you could use Kelly criterion to help kind of diversify over time by not overbetting. So the upshot is basically overbetting, even in the face of an edge, you'll still go bust if you're compounding. Right. With enough bets, of course, and that's where all the limits and stuff come in, and so but
this is a well-known problem actually with Kelly, and in fact, I think there's an issue similar to this which has been encountered in CTA land, where you hear about very famous turtle traders and who did extremely well for a period of time and then went bankrupt repeatedly.
Right.
In any case.
And so the point of, I guess, this paper would be to take this simple intuition and extend it to maybe a more realistic price process that, can capture the jumps that you might see in a financial return series, time series, stuff like that.
Right.
So sizing the bet is the key to this, and all the parameters are constantly changing, correct? I mean, in the real world.
Yeah, right. So of course, practically, you'd have to kind of update this.
So how would you build a model
estimation?
Taking into consideration the return or the likely distribution of returns? Or I'm saying, as the market is changing, and it's not a 60% likelihood of
right,
and it goes up to 70 or it goes up to 80 or it goes to 40. How does that? I'm looking up at your graph there. Your plot would then move, right?
Right. Yeah, you're saying like if P was unknown, or it's changing over time, your probabilities are changing. Yeah, I mean that's kind of the magic question.
So
Kelly says what to do if you know this. Given we know we have an edge and we think we've done our estimation right and built our models appropriately, what should you do? But it doesn't necessarily tell you how to do any of that. Right?
So how do you build a model that are dynamically changing on a moment-to-moment basis, on an hour-to-hour basis?
Yeah, that's a tougher question. I wouldn't be sure.
For a short term, like a relative high turnover signal of 60%, 60-40 is a huge edge. So, actually, I would argue that normally, like for daily signal, that's a huge. I mean, you just being 52.
Right, sure.
Compounding immense growth over time. So maybe what we're is the horizon? Because, like if you think not Iraq, but U.S. equities, right, in countries.
Oh, well, no, but you can change. There's a formula that allows you to change all these parameters, and you can see what your optimal F is, right? So, but yeah, to the question of how do you estimate those parameters, I mean, yeah, that's if we knew what all the parameters would be, right? I mean, I think most people would be doing pretty well quantitatively. Like that's a whole nother subject, which I'm not sure.
So I'm missing, and maybe Leon knows there's somebody else in the room. Like in a lot of the back tests we tend to run, if you're on a daily, maybe Rudy knows, on a daily frequency, if you have a very tiny edge, right, as you compound to kind of rolling quarters and 12-month periods, it basically goes to, you can get 100%, no down rolling years or longer time horizons, as long as you have a little bit of an edge, 3%, 5% on a daily frequency. And how does one translate that? What is the sort of horizon here?
What would the horizon here be? I wouldn't be sure off the top of my head. These are,
Should have looked up.
Yeah. Yeah. This was the main work that allowed me to get my PhD in the math department. So it'll be more on the theoretical side.
That's where the continuous time meets the real world. I'm trying to do
Of course.
head, because continuous time math I learned, I never managed to translate that.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, the mic has to actually be close to the speaker. Oh, okay. So the person, please come again. So okay, I think what Torsten is saying is, the bet frequency, because I guess the context of Kelly is more like if you're betting repeatedly in a casino as opposed to
Right.
you're rebalancing. Sorry. Right. No, that's fair. I mean, so each bet could be a day or a week or some uniform time interval, right? And so, I don't really have good intuition. What do you think? Do you have any sense of how that works, or you've been mostly focused on
at the higher frequency? Yeah, I'm not sure at the moment. I mean, yeah, these are good research questions.
Okay.
So it is actually not very clear. I mean, it's much more complex to determine what is the, let's say if you're now turning over down to 4 stocks, taking 500 bets, that's probably not what you want. So I guess it's not as easy to handle. You need to both determine some, we're trying to map it out. You need to, it's based on balancing frequency, but it's also based on the nature of the portfolio that we want. I think that's, it's in the, I just somehow remember that.
Okay, so Torsten is raising some other very interesting issues. I love this discussion, by the way, that if you then sort of try to connect that to Bernoulli Bet and the number of effective bets or whatever, and then you're actually down to how many you guys are actually taking as opposed to all good questions. I feel like this thing in the literature, and maybe they haven't really been
one bet.
okay.
So
It's at the
that's future research. So this problem is not so the number of bets. It's through time. You do one bet, when how much do you bet? And I go.
Fair enough. Okay, so Rudy's point is that it's at the portfolio level. If you hedge at portfolio level and you say whatever it is, if it's 60,
Mine was one bet. We know.
Well, we haven't realistically.
The math, what it just showed.
I know, but we're trying to connect those. We're trying to bridge the gap between the two worlds, right? As an investor in real life, sometimes you're not just placing. Right? So you got a portfolio, like a stock portfolio, you're rebalancing as a quant market neutral investor or whatever. So we're trying to connect that.
That's just another way of saying what their edges.
Right. So what's the edge of the portfolio level, the IC or whatever, as opposed to.
Trying to explain why you have one.
Right. Okay, fair. Okay. And any other observations or there's a lot of cool math in there. And any other thoughts, comments? Yeah. Very good. Well, listen, Austin, thank you for your
Thanks for having me.
and I feel bad because you're far away. We're having a somewhat more festive time here. Wish we could teleport the drinks in.
Yeah.
And the ambiance over to you. But whenever you're in town, I actually live and work right next to Francis Tavern, so we'll do drinks in person when we're in town. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So much. On behalf of both of you, a round of applause for Austin Pollok.
Thanks.
Turn this off.
It's a completely different question for you. Like what I could say is, if you, so there's obviously like leverage, balance sheet leverage is obviously like kind of like a factor. There's some risk models, like how leveraged the company is, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at the world of ETFs, I don't think there's an ETF equivalent today that does sort of map. I haven't seen like a smart beta ETF that sort of maps to level. Maybe it just doesn't make sense. But there is earnings quality.
Yeah.
But like, what is the best proxy in that world? So you could think of, like in any direction, probably go, which I guess people want to, but it's not the same. So
I mean,
that's
we
like
have something like that. The reason I now because like it's actually been working.
Yeah.
Pretty high.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's actually
Yeah.
up a lot.